So back in the late 1990s, the United States controlled basically the only fully functional global satellite navigation system on the planet.
Right, GPS.
Yeah,
Mhm.
GPS. And it was this marvel of engineering, and it was freely available to the whole world. But, there was a catch.
Pretty big catch, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Because it was an American military asset, the U.S. could just, at any moment, completely degrade the signal for anyone else.
And they actually did this.
They did. During the Kargil War in 1999, they denied high-resolution GPS data to the Indian military. And, at the time, pulling that lever just seemed like this ultimate display of structural power. Like, you don't do what we want. Well, we turn off your ability to navigate.
Right, it feels like checkmate.
Exactly. But let's look at the actual physics of what happened next. Because by pulling that lever, the U.S. didn't actually force permanent compliance.
No, not at all.
Instead, they just provided this exact curriculum that the rest of the world needed. I mean, India immediately accelerated its own regional navigation system, NAVIC. The European Union built Galileo, China built Beidou, Russia poured funding back into GLONASS.
So basically, by using that monopoly as a weapon, the system architect inadvertently funded and, incentivized the creation of parallel architectures.
Exactly. Architectures that eventually just completely dissolved their own monopoly.
I mean, that historical anecdote is it's the absolute perfect lens for what we are looking at today.
Yeah.
It captures this really profound misunderstanding of how power actually operates when an environment undergoes a major structural transition.
Right, because you assume the dependency is permanent.
Exactly. When you use your position in a system to apply pressure, you naturally assume the target will just, absorb the pain and comply.
Yeah.
But as that GPS example illustrates, I mean, the dependency is only permanent until the pain of compliance outweighs the cost of building an alternative.
Which brings us to why we're here. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are looking at a text that takes that exact dynamic, that miscalculation of leverage, and applies it to the entire global system.
And it's a fascinating read.
It really is. The book is Sandeep Chavan's 2026 work, The American Dilemma. And just to be clear with you listening right now, our mission here is to strip away the usual ideological commentary.
Right. No politics today.
Exactly. We aren't looking at this through like a political lens, and we're not making moral judgments about who should or shouldn't be in charge of the world.
Yeah, we're looking purely at the mechanics.
The physics of power, how it behaves, how it adapts, and crucially, how it completely misfires when leaders misunderstand the environment they're actually operating in.
And Chavan's core thesis here is that the world has shifted out of this era of what he calls resolution thinking.
Where you apply pressure to force a clear outcome.
Right, and we've moved into an era of managed stress, where the environment actively resists and reroutes your pressure.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the friction we are seeing across the globe right now.
What's fascinating here is that this friction isn't an indicator that major powers are suddenly incompetent. It is an indicator that the underlying environment just no longer aligns automatically with their historical methods of control.
The architecture of the world has changed, but the reflexes of the organizations running it haven't.
Exactly.
So before we can understand why the global system feels so chaotic today, we have to look back at why it felt so stable for decades. I mean, what did power look like when it didn't have to shout?
Well, Chavan talks about the silent architecture of post-WWII American power.
Right, but I have to say, my initial pushback when reading this was that American power post-WWWII certainly didn't seem silent.
I mean, sure, there were wars.
Yeah, massive military interventions, the whole Cold War, it felt very loud. So how does he justify calling it a silent architecture?
Well, it's a really crucial distinction. The military interventions were visible anomalies. They were localized exceptions to the broader rule.
Okay.
Because the actual day-to-day engine of the system was structural, not coercive. Chavan argues that power is actually functioning at its absolute highest efficiency when you don't even recognize it as power.
Right, it looks like gravity.
Exactly. It's invisible, it's automatic, and it's entirely undeniable. In the decades following the Second World War, American influence wasn't experienced by the majority of the world primarily as like a series of demands or threats.
It was just experienced as the baseline definition of normality.
Right.
Because it was built into the plumbing of the global economy.
Yeah. Let's look at the mechanics of the Bretton Woods financial system as a prime example. They didn't build a system that required an army to enforce compliance.
No.
They built a system that made participation the most rational, low-friction choice available to any sovereign state.
Right. You had the IMF, the World Bank.
The establishment of the dollar as the global reserve currency. All of these functioned as an alignment engine.
So if a nation wanted to rebuild its infrastructure or access deep pools of capital or just settle trade predictably.
They used that architecture.
Right. So, I mean, if I'm a nation state in 1960, I'm not using the dollar because I'm terrified of an American invasion. I'm using the dollar because if I try to use anything else, my transaction costs skyrocket, my risk profile explodes, and literally no one will trade with me.
And that right there is the essence of gravity. The friction of opting out was immense.
Yeah.
And the benefits of opting in were immediate and tangible. Financial power, when it's functioning as a silent architecture, just fades completely into the background.
It just looks like economics.
Right. Your decisions as a foreign leader appear to be purely economic, driven by your own domestic self-interest.
Not political decisions driven by external pressure.
Exactly. The system doesn't demand your loyalty. It just rewards your participation so heavily that loyalty becomes this sort of mathematical byproduct.
Wow, yeah. And Chavan argues this extended to the security environment too, right? That security was less about pointing a weapon and more about latent capability.
Yes, the security umbrella operated on the exact same principle. It was a quiet assurance.
Right.
The capability was massive, sure, but it existed primarily in a latent state. It acted as a backstop.
It wasn't about daily performative threats.
No, or constant signaling. By creating an environment where the existential fear of invasion or blockade was significantly reduced for allied nations, those actors could just focus their domestic energy entirely on economic growth.
Growth that took place within that financial architecture we just talked about.
Exactly. The two systems reinforced each other perfectly.
You know, it reminds me of how a truly dominant tech platform operates before it starts trying to squeeze its users for margin.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Like, think about the early days of a major search engine or a smartphone operating system. You don't use it because you're forced to. You use it because it genuinely organizes the information you need better than anything else out there.
Right.
You never read the terms of service. You never fight the interface. You just tap the screen because the path of least resistance has been designed to align perfectly with your daily goals.
It's a highly applicable metaphor. Compliance isn't demanded. It's just a structural byproduct of convenience and utility.
Yeah.
But Chavan's thesis pivots on what happens when the ecosystem changes. To use your tech metaphor, what happens when the knowledge required to build an operating system is no longer a monopoly?
Right.
When capabilities diffuse across the globe, that silence stops working.
Because the environment stops automatically cooperating. The structural gravity weakens.
Precisely. And this is an inherent, unavoidable side effect of building a successful global system.
How so?
Well, as the silent architecture expanded and brought more nations into the fold, the knowledge required to operate within it and eventually replicate it also spread.
Right. Technology transfer, globalized education.
Exactly. Modular industrial organization. These things form a self-reinforcing loop. Dominance expressed through an open architecture inherently trains the participants.
Oh, wow. So you're literally teaching them how to build the thing.
Yes. And once that participation turns into independent, localized capability, the perceived inevitability of the original architect begins to dissolve.
Which brings us to the transition into what Chavan calls audible force. This is where the silence ends.
Right, the volume goes up.
Yeah, when the automatic alignment fades, the power has to make itself known. We start seeing constant sanctions lists, sweeping export controls, tariffs, military posturing, highly publicized embargoes.
And here's where Chavan makes one of his most vital diagnostic points.
Okay.
When observers, journalists, market analysts, even historians, see a major power suddenly throwing around sanctions and tariffs, the instinct is to read it in one of two ways.
Which are?
They either read it as a sudden projection of immense renewed strength, or they read it as a panicked reaction to imminent decline.
I fall into that trap all the time. Like, if I see a country aggressively sanctioning a rival, my instinct is to think, wow, they're really bringing the hammer down. They must be incredibly powerful to be able to isolate someone like that.
And it's a totally logical assumption based on the old physics.
Right.
But Chavan argues that reading is fundamentally shallow. In a structurally diffused world, highly visible punitive reactions are actually a diagnostic signal of structural thinning.
Structural thinning. Explain the mechanics of that.
Think about it mechanically. If the system was still functioning efficiently, the misalignment wouldn't have occurred in the first place.
Oh,
or it would have been corrected quietly through structural incentives. Power now has to intervene explicitly and loudly because the environment no longer aligns automatically.
So the visibility of the force is actually a symptom of a mismatch.
Yes. The power isn't necessarily weaker in absolute terms. Like, the military might still be the strongest, the financial sector might still be the deepest, but the environment has become resistant.
The silent architecture can't carry the load on its own anymore.
Right. Audible force is just the friction generated when old tools are dragged across a new, non-cooperative surface.
Okay, let me challenge that slightly.
Sure.
If a mature power recognizes that the environment has changed, if they see that the old silent methods are generating all this friction, why do they keep doing it? I mean, these systems are run by incredibly intelligent, data-driven people.
They are.
So if the strategy is causing structural thinning, why not simply alter the strategy?
Because the shift requires navigating a profound structural tension between rank and relevance.
Okay, rank versus relevance.
Yeah, and this is a paradox that doesn't just define global geopolitics. It dictates the life cycle of almost any massive legacy organization.
Let's break down the definitions here, because this rank versus relevance paradox is totally central to the entire book. How does Chavan differentiate the two?
Let's look at the mechanics of each. Rank is strictly positional.
Okay.
It is about holding the definitive top spot in a recognized hierarchy. To maintain rank, you must engage in constant visibility, firm boundary setting, and strict enforcement.
So rank is fundamentally about who gets to sit upstream and write the operational rules for everyone else.
Exactly. And for decades, if you were the architect of the system, preserving your rank and preserving your relevance were the exact same task.
Because there was only one game in town.
Right. Sitting at the top made you universally relevant.
Like, if you run the only bank in the village, protecting your status as the bank manager and being useful to the villagers are basically indistinguishable.
That's a perfect way to put it. But relevance is entirely relational.
Yep.
It doesn't depend on your title. It depends on your utility and your fit within an evolving ecosystem.
Right.
In a diffused, multipolar world where multiple overlapping games are being played simultaneously, maintaining relevance requires immense flexibility.
It requires restraint.
Yes, and a willingness to accept partial modular alignment.
Meaning, like, I might buy my software from you, but I'm going to secure my supply chain through someone else. I'm relevant to you in one vector, but not in another.
Yes, and here is the mechanical paradox. In a highly modular global system, you cannot maximize both rank and relevance simultaneously.
They become inverse forces.
Exactly. If you attempt to enforce your rank too aggressively, if you demand 100% compliance, if you force nations to choose binary sides.
If you weaponize access to the system to punish deviations.
Right. If you do all that, you introduce massive friction. You might temporarily protect your positional authority, but you actively accelerate the search for alternatives by other actors.
You damage your long-term relevance by proving that you are a risky conditional partner.
Precisely.
But isn't giving up rank basically admitting defeat? Like, on the flip side, if you prioritize relevance.
If you prioritize relevance too visibly, if you accept ambiguity, if you allow rivals to share the stage, if you refuse to punish transgressions just to keep trade flowing, you erode the perception of your absolute leadership.
You dilute your rank.
Exactly. Your domestic base will accuse you of weakness, and your allies might question your resolve. How do you convince a superpower, or even a legacy corporation, to step back and stop acting super?
I see this exact dynamic in corporate history all the time.
Oh, absolutely.
Look at a company like IBM in the early 90s, or Nokia in the late 2000s. They had absolute rank in their respective industries.
Unquestionable rank.
Yeah. And when the environment shifted, when personal computing decentralized, or when the smartphone operating system became more important than the hardware, they tried to enforce their rank.
They did.
They tried to force the market to keep playing by their legacy rules because stepping back and just being a relevant hardware provider felt like a massive defeat.
And that feeling of defeat is the psychological barrier Chavan identifies. He gives it a specific term, identity lag.
Identity lag.
Yeah, and this is why intelligent, data-driven leaders consistently make seemingly irrational structural choices.
Explain the mechanics of that. I mean, how does an entire institution suffer from a lag in identity?
Well, large systems, whether they're nation-states, intelligence agencies, or Fortune 500 companies, they are incredibly efficient at preserving memory.
Okay.
They institutionalize the specific behaviors, doctrines, and reflexes that made them successful in their formative eras. Doctrine is refined over decades. It's very rarely reinvented from scratch. Therefore, institutional memory is vastly superior to institutional sensory capability. They remember what worked yesterday much better than they sense what is changing today.
So they just continue to use legacy reflexes?
Yes, they reach for the old tools of strict control and hierarchical posturing, because letting go of that historical role doesn't just feel like a shift in strategy.
It feels like an abandonment of the self.
Exactly. To quote the source text directly, power does not adapt at the speed of reality. It adapts at the speed of identity.
Wow. It adapts at the speed of identity.
Right.
That is a brilliant way to frame it.
It really is.
The system still fundamentally perceives itself as the singular architect of the world. So it looks at the friction and assumes the world is just misbehaving, completely unaware that the underlying environment simply no longer supports their legacy behavior.
And because of that identity lag, when they encounter resistance, their institutional reflex isn't to redesign the system.
No, their reflex is to apply more pressure.
Exactly. Which brings us to the mechanical failure of those old tools.
Right. If your identity tells you that you are the boss and someone disobeys, you pull the lever of punishment. You apply pressure.
But as we're about to see, that lever is broken.
Yeah, Chavan argues that this entire concept, pressure theory, is now fundamentally broken, or at least it operates in a way that actively harms the user. So let's unpack the failure of pressure theory.
To understand why it fails today, we have to understand why it worked so well in the past.
Okay.
Pressure theory is the relatively straightforward idea that if you squeeze an actor hard enough, economically, diplomatically, technologically, they will eventually calculate that the pain of resistance is higher than the cost of compliance.
They'll submit.
Right. And that intuition worked exceptionally well for decades because dependencies were largely vertical and viable alternatives were basically scarce to non-existent.
Right. If you controlled the only global financial clearinghouse and you cut off a nation's access, the mechanical result was that their economy collapsed inward.
Because they couldn't magically invent a new global banking system overnight. They collapsed inward because the pressure had nowhere else to go. Compliance was the only mathematically rational choice for survival.
But the global system today is no longer a series of vertical, isolated silos.
No, it is overwhelmingly horizontal and deeply modular.
And this structural shift enables a phenomenon Chavan calls consequence routing.
Yes.
Consequence routing. I really want to spend some time here because this concept completely reframed how I read literally every single piece of news about international sanctions or trade wars.
It changes everything.
What exactly is consequence routing from a mechanical standpoint?
Consequence routing is the mechanism by which modern modular systems redirect applied stress laterally rather than absorbing it directly.
Okay.
When blunt pressure, say, a sweeping economic sanction enters the global system today, it doesn't land on a single point and cause an isolated explosion.
Right.
The targeted system is embedded in a highly complex network. So the stress encounters multiple potential pathways for mitigation.
Like economic workarounds, technological substitution.
Geographic intermediaries, exactly.
It's like squeezing a water balloon.
That is the perfect analogy. If you have a water balloon resting on a table and you push down hard on the center with your fist, you are applying maximum vertical pressure.
Right.
In a rigid system, the object shatters. When a fluid modular system just routes the volume elsewhere, the water bulges out around your fist.
The shape fundamentally changes.
The distribution of the mass shifts, but the balloon itself does not pop. The harder you squeeze, the more aggressively the system reroutes to accommodate the intrusion.
Okay, let's move out of the metaphor and into the actual mechanics. If a superpower sanctions a mid-sized economy today, shutting them out of the primary banking system, what does consequence routing actually look like in practice?
In practice, it looks like a rapid acceleration of lateral connections.
Okay.
The targeted state doesn't collapse inward. It spreads the cost across multiple nodes. First, trade is physically rerouted through non-aligned third parties.
So goods that used to flow directly are now shipped to an intermediary country, repackaged and sent onward.
Exactly. Second, they utilize alternative financial mechanisms. Instead of using the dominant messaging system like SWIFT, They might integrate with regional alternatives.
Or rely on bilateral currency swap agreements where they trade directly in their own domestic currencies, completely bypassing the dollar.
Yes. And this leads to an incredible inversion that Chavan points out.
Touches.
We used to think of sanctions as a way to close doors and trap an opponent.
Right.
But consequence routing means that force no longer closes doors. It opens side exits.
I mean, it's more profound than just opening side exits, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It actually provides the targeted system with actionable intelligence.
Wow. Yeah.
When you apply targeted export controls or financial sanctions, you're essentially exposing the exact blueprint of your leverage.
You're showing the target system precisely which supply chain inputs are critical, which financial flows are most heavily monitored, and where there's single points of failure located.
Exactly.
I hadn't thought of it that way. You are basically handing them an itemized receipt of their own vulnerabilities?
Yes. And for the system under pressure, that receipt is a curriculum. The sanction acts as an educational tool.
It teaches the target exactly what they need to substitute, bypass, or invent internally in order to survive.
Right. Every attempt to enforce compliance through pressure actively strengthens their survivability engineering for the next iteration of conflict.
So what you intended to be a mechanism of leverage becomes a real-world stress test that literally trains them how to live without you.
Exactly.
I want to look at the two massive data points Chavan uses to illustrate this shift towards survivability. First, the pandemic.
Right.
He argues the pandemic wasn't just a health event. It was the structural shock that killed the era of efficiency.
It was a global revelation regarding the fragility of optimized systems.
Yeah.
Prior to 2020, efficiency was the absolute ultimate language of corporate and geopolitical competence.
Supply chains were incredibly lean.
Using just-in-time manufacturing, optimized for minimal inventory cost and maximum speed. It was a beautiful, highly synchronized machine.
But a machine that required the environment to remain perfectly stable.
Exactly. The pandemic stripped away the buffer of systemic normalcy. It proved structurally that systems mathematically optimized for efficiency are fundamentally brittle when exposed to high variability.
Right, a single disruption at a major port or a localized factory shut down, and it cascaded through the entire global network within days.
And after that trauma, the narrative fundamentally inverted.
Reliability outranked efficiency.
Reliability, continuity, and resilience became the primary metrics of success.
Yeah.
States and transnational corporations realized that building redundancy into their systems, having multiple suppliers in different geographic regions, stockpiling critical components, even if it severely reduces quarterly profit margins, is no longer viewed as wasteful.
It is recognized as an absolute survival mechanism.
Exactly. And that psychological shift set the stage for how the world reacted to the next major data point, the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
Chavan points to this as the ultimate real-time stress test of legacy pressure theory versus modern consequence routing.
It is the defining case study because we witnessed an unprecedented, highly coordinated application of economic and financial pressure by the legacy architects of the global system.
Right.
The expectation, heavily influenced by identity lag and old models of vertical leverage, was that the sheer sudden weight of these sanctions would trigger an immediate economic collapse.
Forcing a rapid cessation of hostilities or total compliance, the assumption was that the water balloon would instantly pop.
But the balloon routed.
Yeah.
The repeated pressure did not restore structural alignment. Instead, it forcefully accelerated what Chavan calls survivability engineering.
The targeted systems absorbed the initial shock, and because they had already internalized the lessons of the pandemic, they prioritized systemic survival over reintegration.
Exactly.
Let's get specific on the how. How did they engineer that survivability?
Mechanically, they utilized every avenue of consequence routing available.
Okay.
They deployed massive shadow fleets of aging oil tankers with obscure ownership structures and non-Western insurance to continue exporting energy. They routed high-tech consumer goods through neighboring states in Central Asia and the Caucasus. They leaned heavily into alternative payment settlement architectures.
So the friction was high, and the domestic economic cost was significant, but the structural collapse never actually arrived.
Right.
The pressure didn't break them, it just trained them to operate entirely in the dark outside the primary architecture.
Precisely. And this leads us to the most dangerous phase for the legacy system architect.
If squeezing the balloon just forces the water elsewhere.
And if they're successfully engineering their own survivability, Well, that redirected energy isn't just floating in a vacuum.
Right. It's going into entirely parallel systems.
Exactly. The routed trade, the alternative financial clearing, the new supply chains, they begin to coalesce. They crystallize into entirely parallel architectures.
Which means we are no longer just talking about surviving pressure. We are talking about active competition.
Yes.
And Chavan makes a stark distinction here between tactical rivalry and architectural competition.
This is where the physics of power fundamentally changed the game. Tactical rivalry is the geopolitical equivalent of a boxing match.
It's what we are most accustomed to analyzing.
Right. It's tit for tat. One side raises a tariff on steel. The other side blocks a shipment of soybeans. It is direct, visible confrontation.
It's loud, and it makes for great headlines.
It does, but it contains a hidden structural assumption.
Which is?
Tactical rivalry fundamentally assumes that both actors are still fighting within the same overall system, arguing over the same set of rules.
Okay.
When you attempt to block your rival's access to a resource, you are implicitly relying on the fact that they are dependent on your architecture to acquire it.
Right. Like, I can block you because I own the toll booth.
But architectural competition is a totally different paradigm. It is the strategy of deliberately building parallel, substitute systems that absolutely do not require your opponent's permission or their toll booth to operate.
And this is how Chavan frames the structural challenge presented by China. And again, just to reiterate our ground rules here for you listening, we are looking at this purely as a diagnostic analysis of systems, not a political judgment of state actors.
Of course.
So how does China's strategy function mechanically in this context?
Structurally, Chavan argues that China's primary modality of competition is not attempting to openly overturn the existing rules in a dramatic, kinetic confrontation.
Right.
Instead, they are engaged in a massive, patient project of bypass.
Bypassing.
Yes. They use their immense industrial scale, their domestic market size, and a strategy of what Chavan terms closed loops to systematically engineer vulnerabilities out of their system.
What does a closed loop actually look like?
It means designing an entire life cycle for a critical technology or resource that never crosses into a jurisdiction controlled by a rival.
Oh, wow.
Right? If you mine the raw material domestically, process it in allied nations, manufacture the component locally, and write the software using indigenous code, you have created a closed loop.
You're designing an architecture that can host economic continuity even when external pressures or sanctions reach maximum levels.
That is exactly it.
So they aren't trying to kick the current CEO out of the global boardroom. They're just quietly purchasing the empty lot next door, pouring their own concrete, laying their own fiber optic cables, setting up their own currency swap lines, and basically saying to the rest of the world, hey, if the other building gets too expensive or too unpredictable, our doors are open.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And structurally speaking, that bypassing strategy is infinitely more dangerous to an established power than a direct tactical military or economic confrontation.
See, let me push back on this because I feel like a lot of legacy thinkers would say, no, a direct confrontation is worse. Building a parallel bank isn't as scary as building a parallel military.
But it's more dangerous to the architecture because it dissolves the mechanism of leverage itself. If a rival confronts you directly within the existing system, you can utilize your accumulated rank to punish them. You can freeze their assets, you can blockade their ports, you can vote them out of institutions.
Right.
But if they are engaged in successful architectural competition, your ability to block them mathematically approaches zero. You cannot threaten to evict someone from a house they no longer live in.
Wow, yeah. Bypassing dissolves the dependency that makes your pressure effective.
Exactly.
Okay, let me push back on this again because it sounds like you're painting a picture of two completely separate worlds. The US-led legacy architecture over here and the new parallel architecture over there.
Right.
But the world isn't actually splitting perfectly in half, is it? Look at India or the Gulf states. They aren't picking just one building.
You're entirely right, and that brings us to the operational reality for the rest of the globe. The vast majority of nations have absolutely no desire to be forced into a binary Cold War-style choice between architectures.
Because the economic cost of entirely decoupling from either side is catastrophic.
Exactly. So they adopt a strategy Chavan defines as multi-track alignment.
Multi-track alignment, how does that function?
It is the operationalization of extreme pragmatism. In a multipolar, structurally diffused environment, actors hedge their bets constantly.
Right.
A major regional power, like India, for example, might engage in deep military and intelligence cooperation with the United States to ensure regional security.
Sure.
Simultaneously, they might purchase immense quantities of discounted energy from Russia, settling those trades outside the dollar. And on a third track, they might rely heavily on Chinese telecommunications components or raw materials for their domestic manufacturing base.
But to a legacy thinker suffering from identity lag, that just looks like betrayal, or at least chronic indecision. Like, why won't they just pick a side?
Yes, it is frequently misread as indecision or opportunism, but Chavan argues it is highly rational, sophisticated risk management. In a world where no single architecture can guarantee absolute stability under stress, maintaining strategic autonomy is the only logical choice for survival. They are deliberately preserving multiple exit routes.
They want a foot in every door so they can't be locked inside any single building.
Exactly. The text specifically highlights regions like the Middle East transitioning from being perceived as proxy battlegrounds into acting as active system balancers.
System balancers.
Right. They leverage their capital and energy resources to attract investment and technology from all competing architectures, effectively preventing any single power from dictating the regional terms.
They engage selectively based purely on utility.
Completely stripping ideology from the equation.
Which brings us to the ultimate question for you, the listener. If you are a leader, whether you're the President of the United States or the CDO of a legacy corporation watching your market share erode to modular upstarts, how do you actually lead in this environment?
It's the multi-million-dollar question.
Right. Your partners are hedging via multi-track alignment. Your pressure tactics are just teaching your rivals how to survive. And enforcing your rank is actively destroying your relevance. How do you win a game where the opponent refuses to meet you on the battlefield?
Yeah.
What is the structural solution?
Well, you don't fight it with escalation. Escalation just proves to everyone else that they need to decouple from you faster. You fight it with design.
Design.
It requires a fundamental, agonizing psychological shift. Chavan dedicates the final portion of his text to defining what he calls coordination-based leadership.
Okay.
He argues that the future does not belong to the hegemon who attempts to command and control a centralized system. The future belongs to the system designer who coordinates a highly plural, fragmented field.
System designer. Okay, I need you to translate that into mechanics, because when I hear coordination-based leadership, the cynical part of my brain says that's just academic jargon for giving up and letting everyone do what they want.
It's the exact opposite of giving up. It is the strategic conservation of power. To achieve this, Chavan introduces the operational concept of strategic non-interference.
Strategic non-interference.
This is the highly disciplined practice of doing significantly less at the surface in order to shape much more beneath it.
Doing less to shape more. Explain the physics of that.
In a highly diffused horizontal system, constant intervention, reacting to every minor slight, issuing sanctions for every deviation, publicly demanding loyalty, it does not project strength.
Right.
It broadcasts profound insecurity. It signals to the network that your system is fragile and requires constant manual maintenance.
And as we discussed with consequence routing, every time you intervene, you give them data.
Exactly. By practicing strategic non-interference, by intervening only sparingly and strictly on issues of absolute vital interest, power denies those escalation cues to its opponents.
You stop providing the curriculum they use to engineer their survivability. So, by staying quiet, you are actually maintaining the informational upper hand. You aren't giving them a predictable daily pattern of friction to ride around.
Yes. Silence respects the agency of the other actors in the system, which naturally reduces their incentive to rebel. And crucially, it restores asymmetry.
How so?
When a power that exercises immense restraint finally does move, the action carries massive systemic weight. It isn't just noise. It is an undeniable shift in gravity.
Wow. This sounds like a shift from being a landlord to being a protocol.
That is a brilliant way to frame Chavan's transition from ownership to stewardship.
Ownership to stewardship.
Yes. Ownership assumes that the system belongs to you, and therefore any deviation is a theft or a direct insult that must be punished.
Which leads to episodic control.
Yes. Episodic control is exhausting. It requires pulling the lever constantly. It demands immense resources to monitor compliance, punish defectors, and issue threats.
It inevitably causes massive systemic fatigue for everyone involved, including the architect.
Exactly.
So what does stewardship look like mechanically?
Stewardship operates from the acceptance that absolute monopoly has permanently ended, but vital relevance has not. Instead of episodic control, the system designer focuses entirely on structural presence.
Meaning what? Setting the standards?
Setting the standards, building the foundational platforms, defining the technological protocols, and reducing transaction costs for anyone who participates.
Like good tech design.
Think about open source software like Linux. The creators don't demand you use it. They don't punish you if you modify it.
Right.
They just made the foundational architecture so incredibly useful, so adaptable, and so low friction that the vast majority of the world's servers run on it. They achieved absolute structural presence without episodic control.
It is the paradox of restraint realized. By intentionally doing less to command the surface, the power achieves vastly more integration beneath it.
Exactly.
It's about being the incredibly useful, low-friction platform that everyone naturally relies on to conduct their business, rather than the overbearing boss everyone actively resents. Because if you are the resentful boss, they will endure the pain to build a parallel architecture to bypass you. But if you are the protocol, why would they ever leave?
They wouldn't, because the math wouldn't support it. And this leads to Chavan's final synthesis.
Okay.
When the era of automatic dominance fades, what actually survives? He identifies 5 core attributes:
Okay.
architecture, relevance, coordination, credibility, and endurance. Notice that force and rank are not on that list.
Right.
Power without credibility is loud, highly reactive, and structurally fragile. It pays a massive cost for every compliance it forces. But power with credibility is quiet, highly adaptive, and ultimately persistent.
This has been an incredibly dense, fascinating unraveling of how systems actually function.
It really is a paradigm shift.
And to ensure that you, the listener, can actually deploy these concepts, whether you're analyzing supply chain shifts in your industry, trying to decipher the subtext of a geopolitical crisis, or just trying to navigate a massive reorganization at your own company, we want to end with something practical.
The toolkit.
Exactly. We are calling it the Chavanian Glossary for Strategists. 3 distinct concepts that redefine the physics of power. Let's lock these in.
I will define them strictly through the structural mechanics we've unpacked today. Term number 1 is inevitability architecture.
Inevitability architecture.
This represents the absolute highest, most efficient form of systemic power. It is the practice of designing a system, an economic platform, or a technological standard so seamlessly and with such undeniable utility that participation becomes a purely rational mathematical choice for external actors.
It functions like gravity.
Exactly. You do not need to coerce, threaten, or sanction anyone. Alignment occurs naturally because the friction and cost of deviation are simply too high to justify.
So you want to be the inevitability architecture in whatever ecosystem you operate in, because if your partners or clients feel trapped and forced to use you, they are already secretly funding the construction of a side exit.
Right.
If they use you because the transaction costs are lower than anywhere else, you have won the architectural competition. Okay, term number 2.
Identity lag. This is the profound temporal mismatch between an institution's memory and its current sensory environment.
Okay.
It occurs when an organization, a nation-state, or a leadership team continues to rely on legacy reflexes, such as authoritative posturing, blunt pressure tactics, or the expectation of automatic compliance.
We're completely unaware that the structural environment has diffused and no longer supports that behavior.
Precisely. They are operating at the speed of their historical self-image, entirely disconnected from the speed of current reality.
The machine's physics have fundamentally changed, but the operator just keeps pulling the old lever harder and harder, assuming the problem is a lack of effort rather than a change in the laws of motion.
That's a great way to put it.
And finally, the third term.
The noise tax. This is the steep, compounding systemic cost paid by an architect when they rely on audible force.
The cost of friction.
Exactly. It is the price paid in attention fatigue, the rapid erosion of legitimacy, and the inadvertent training of systemic resistance. Every time a leader issues a public threat, applies a unilateral sanction, or attempts to force compliance through friction rather than structural redesign, they are paying the noise tax.
Their signals lose contrast.
Right. Their leverage degrades into background noise,
Yeah.
and they actively provide the curriculum their targets need to engineer survivability.
The noise tax. That perfectly encapsulates the cost of ignoring the transition.
It really does.
So as we close this deep dive, I want to bring it back to you. The mechanics we've discussed today, the failure of pressure, consequence routing, the shift from rank to relevance, they scale perfectly.
They absolutely do.
They apply to the macro maneuvers of nuclear superpowers, but they apply just as cleanly to the dynamics of a disruptive startup challenging a legacy monopoly or a manager trying to guide a fiercely independent team. The physics of power remain consistent.
The environment across all those scales has become horizontal, highly modular, and saturated with alternatives.
Huh.
The era of the single vertical silo is over.
And so we leave you with a final provocative thought to examine in your own ecosystem. We talked at the very beginning about that comforting illusion of the lever, the idea that we have linear, mechanical control over our environment, and that if we just apply enough pressure, we can force the outcome we want.
Right.
But if you look around and realize the machine is no longer responding to the lever, you have to ask yourself a deeply uncomfortable question. Look at your strategy. Look at where you spend your energy and your capital. Are you exhausting yourself trying to frantically protect your historical rank? Or are you quietly, structurally redesigning your relevance?